This is a referendum conceived in a coup. It was born from a presidential coup that Kais Saied, who was democratically elected in 2019, made exactly 1 year ago. He argued that Tunisia's entire political class, including media outlets and civil society organizations and all political parties, were responsible for corruption, and that their corruption was the reason why Tunisians are experiencing so many problems economically. So his answer was to shut the democratically elected parliament with army tanks exactly 1 year ago, and to seize all three branches of government in his own hands. In the years since, he's been ruling by personal fiat, almost like a sultan. He has systematically been checking the boxes of dictatorial consolidation, assaulting judicial independence, taking over the formerly independent Elections Commission, dragging his critics in front of military courts. So there's just a litany of reasons why people with expertise in and passion for representative, pluralistic good governance and human rights object to what Kais Saied has done and his plans for the country. To remove more potential objections to his consolidation of sultanistic power, Kais Saied wanted to create his own constitution and stage a farcical election in which the Tunisian public would get to vote on this constitution, allegedly in an election that would be free enough and fair enough and well organized enough that their vote would actually mean something. But none of that's happened. Kais Saied appears to have solely authored this constitution, wiping out, obliterating the 2014 Constitution of Tunisia, which was painstakingly created through a democratic process that took 2 years and thousands of conversations nationally and locally. Kais Saied wants to replace that, forcing through this referendum in an authoritarian and unfair context that he himself wrote. And there's also a lot of reason to be concerned about how the vote is actually going to be organized on Monday. The Elections Commission, as we mentioned, is not independent anymore. It's hand-picked people who Kais Saied wants. It's extremely disorganized and dysfunctional. Elections trainers and observers around the country who I've been interviewing in the south and center of Tunisia over the past week say that they're not being funded well enough. The observers and organizers aren't being paid well enough. And then there simply aren't enough of them to actually monitor and officiate the process. All political parties, except for one, have decided to boycott or vote no. The political parties are not sending observers. The European Union, United Nations, and most other international organizations are also not sending observers. There's a handful of Tunisian elections observers, civil society, that are trying their best to monitor, but they don't have enough observers. So it's going to be very difficult to adjudicate, to figure out whether the votes on election day are falsified, whether turnout might be falsified. It could potentially be hard to adjudicate that. It's still a bit up in the air. But regardless of what happens on election day itself, even if he's not stuffing ballot boxes or fabricating artificially high turnout, this entire vote is happening in such an unfree, illegitimate context that was born, like we said, conceived in a coup, that it cannot possibly produce a legitimate or reliable vote that can tell us what the actual temperature of Tunisians in terms of this constitution that Kais single-handedly authored is. So this constitution is a stark contrast to Tunisia's democratically drafted 2014 constitution, which, as we said, 2 years of enormous, intense, painstaking debate amongst democratically elected leaders with civil society all over the country at a local level, at a national level, went into making that document. And it passed almost unanimously. In 2014, I'll never forget, there wasn't a dry eye in the House when the Constituent Assembly passed it almost. People were crying, people who had been at ideological loggerheads with each other, just fighting sometimes almost actually fighting in the Constituent Assembly for years with fisticuffs, literal and metaphorical, had come together. And they were crying from pride that Tunisia was the first country in the Arab world to come together and create a democratic, representative, inclusive constitution. It was an enormous achievement. The type of an achievement that would have been unthinkable under Ben Ali, where there wasn't an election that Tunisians didn't already know the outcome to before it happened. You know, under the days of the 99% farcical margins of Ben Ali's victory, it was an incredible shift. Kais Saied's constitution doesn't have even the basic pillars of democratic government that the 2014 constitution had. It doesn't have separation of powers, checks and balances, presidential accountability, firm guarantees for rights and liberties. It also, ironically, contains more provisions that we could describe as Islamist, or provisions of political Islam. In other words, involving the state in the production of potentially religiously conservative or retrogressive patriarchal understandings of Islam than the 2014 constitution, about which many Tunisians and international observers were very concerned, terrified even, that Ennahda, the so-called Islamist party, might, slam its own ideas about religious conservatism into that constitution. But that ended up not happening. The word that I hear more than any other word in Tunisia now is exhaustion. People say, we're so exhausted, we're so tired of all these different permutations of political parties and nobody ever keeping their promises, and the economy being terrible. The economy is worse than it's ever been since I started visiting Tunisia back in 2007. A lot of Tunisians will tell you, listen, we just don't have the bandwidth to deal with thinking about this referendum. Some people will say, inshallah, it'll be okay. But we'll not really be engaged. We don't plan on voting. So there's a lot of people who are clued out and cynical and not participating. And then there's a lot of other people who are boycotting, who believe that to participate in any way, even if it's to vote no, would lend legitimacy to what is a deeply illegitimate process. And for all of these reasons, the yes vote is almost guaranteed to win on Monday. There's no minimum threshold in this constitutional referendum. I mean, it's really stunning and something that's a terrible violation of basic governance standards. When you have a constitutional referendum, that's something so important to determine the entire overarching legal framework of a country, that typically you would have at least a 30% minimum threshold for turnout to make that a legitimate or qualifying vote. But here in Tunisia, Kais Saied has orchestrated this so that there's no minimum. If only 1% of Tunisians turn out to vote, if only 10 individual Tunisians turn out to vote, and most of them vote yes, the referendum is going to pass. So we can almost bet any amount of dinars on the likelihood that Kais will get his referendum, and that after it passes, after he wins, he's going to be more psychologically unfettered than he already is, because he's going to think to himself, now I have a legitimate constitution that most people have allegedly voted for behind me. And now I can go after who I want to go after more powerfully with potentially less blowback. And one of the big questions moving forward is, will the Tunisian people and will the international community buy into that fairy tale? Will they believe in Kais's illegitimate, not evidence-based narrative that this vote is in any way fair or representative of what the population allegedly wants, what Ashab, the people allegedly yurid, wants? That remains to be seen. But the main effects of this referendum will be psychological. It won't actually meaningfully change the amount of power that he has, the real balance of power. He has been ruling like a mini sultan by personal fiat since July 25th of last year. And that's not going to change. The main effects will be psychological on him, on Tunisians, and on internationals.